In 1872, a 14-year-old girl stood in her family's house in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and watched her father come home with a look she had never seen on his face before. He was a man who had built something. He had started with nothing, built wooden oil storage tanks with his own hands, graduated to oil production, and turned a modest business into something the family could be proud of. They had moved into a real house. There were things in that house that had not been possible before. And then, in the space of a few weeks, most of it was gone. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and what she saw on her father's face that afternoon was not grief, exactly. It was something more specific than that. It was the face of a man who had understood for the first time that the rules he had been playing by were not the rules everyone else was using. She wrote about it 30 years later. She said that out of the alarm and bitterness and confusion, she gathered from her father's talk a conviction she would hold for the rest of her life, that what had been done to him was wrong, not unfortunate, not the result of bad luck or poor decisions, wrong. It would take her 30 years to do anything about it. But she did not forget. The man responsible was 32 years old, based in Cleveland, Ohio, and already well on his way to becoming the wealthiest private individual in the history of the United States. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and what he had built in the decade before 1872 was not just a company. It was a system, a method for eliminating competition so thoroughly and so permanently that the word competition would eventually become meaningless in the American oil industry. The method worked like this. Standard Oil, which Rockefeller had incorporated in Ohio in 1870, entered into a secret agreement with the major railroad companies of the era. The agreement gave Standard Oil massive rebates and discounts on oil shipments. This alone would have been a significant advantage. But the scheme went further. Standard Oil also received drawbacks on shipments made by its competitors, which meant that every time an independent oil producer shipped their product by rail, a portion of what they paid went directly into Rockefeller's pocket. The independent producers were not just competing against Standard Oil. They were, without knowing it, subsidizing it. The scheme was called the South Improvement Company, and when its existence became public in 1872, it caused what historians would later call the Cleveland Massacre. In the space of 6 weeks, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of its 26 Cleveland competitors. The method was not subtle. Rockefeller's representatives would arrive at an independent refinery with an offer: sell to Standard Oil, or attempt to compete against a company with a structural cost advantage you cannot overcome and a railroad network you cannot access on equal terms. Most sold. Franklin Tarbell, Ida's father, refused. He continued to produce independently, struggling to earn a decent living, watching what had once been a promising business become something that merely survived. One of his business partners did not survive. The pressure of what had happened, the debt and the uncertainty and the daily reality of competing against something that was not competing fairly, drove the man to take his own life. Franklin Tarbell assumed his partner's debts. He mortgaged the house. The family did not lose everything, but they lost enough. And Ida Tarbell, at 14 years old, understood at some cellular level that what she had witnessed was not the market working as it should. It was the market working as someone had arranged for it to work. She later wrote, "There was born in me a hatred of privilege of any sort." By 1878, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the refining capacity of the United States. By the mid-1880s, it controlled the pipelines as well. Rockefeller had done what had seemed impossible. He had taken an industry built on chaos and geological accident, on wildcatters and speculators and the random luck of where oil happened to exist underground, and he had imposed upon it a kind of brutal mechanical order. The chaos had been tamed. The prices had stabilized. The efficiencies were real. Rockefeller believed genuinely, and said so publicly and privately, that he was doing the world a service. He was bringing order where there had been disorder. He was creating prosperity where there had been waste. He was not a villain in his own story. He was never a villain in his own story. Ida Tarbell spent the years between 1872 and 1900 becoming someone who could take him on. She was the only woman in her graduating class at Allegheny College in 1880. She taught school for 2 years and found it suffocating. She became managing editor of a publication called the Chautauquan. She quit and moved to Paris, attending classes at the Sorbonne on a budget of $50 a month, supporting herself by selling freelance articles about Parisian life to American magazines. She had refused several marriage proposals. She later said she had come to believe that no woman of her era could be a wife and also pursue a career outside the house. She chose the career. She chose it absolutely and without apparent regret. She was interested in the truth of things. She was interested in how power worked and who it worked for and who it worked against. Marriage, she seems to have concluded, was not going to help her find out. In Paris, she caught the attention of Samuel McClure, editor of McClure's magazine, who was building one of the most important publications of the progressive era. He hired her. She moved back to the United States. Her early work for McClure's was biographical, a series on Napoleon that nearly doubled the magazine's circulation, followed by a series on Abraham Lincoln that established her as one of the most gifted narrative journalists in the country. She had a particular ability to take an enormous, complicated subject and render it as a human story, to find the person inside the event and make the reader understand the event through the person. In 1900, she went looking for a subject worthy of everything she had learned. She did not have to look far. The investigation she undertook over the next 4 years was unlike anything American journalism had attempted at that scale. She spent 2 years going through volumes of public records before she published a single word. Court testimony, state and federal reports, legislative hearings, newspaper coverage going back 30 years. She requested and received interviews with Standard Oil officials, including Henry Rogers, one of Rockefeller's most senior partners, whose meetings with Tarbell had been arranged by Mark Twain. Rogers believed, according to every account of those meetings, that Tarbell was writing a favorable profile. He spoke openly. He defended Standard Oil's practices. He provided information he believed would be used to vindicate the company. When the first article appeared in McClure's in November 1902, Rogers read it and, in the words of one witness who was present, his face went white with rage. He pointed at the page and said, "Where did you get that stuff?" Tarbell informed him that his claims about legitimate competition were false and that the documentary record she had assembled proved it. "Not a word," Rockefeller told his associates when the series began appearing. "Not a word about that misguided woman." He refused every request for comment. He refused every opportunity to respond. He instructed everyone around him to say nothing. It was the correct tactical decision, and it made no difference at all. The documents Tarbell had assembled did not require his response. They required only a reader. The series ran for 19 installments in McClure's between November 1902 and May 1904. It was then collected into a 2-volume book. The investigation documented, systematically and with primary source evidence for nearly every claim, how Standard Oil had used secret railroad agreements to crush competition, how it had used industrial espionage to monitor the movements of its competitors, how it had used its control of pipelines to strangle independent producers who refused to sell, how it had bribed and influenced legislators and regulators across multiple states, and how the entire edifice of one of the greatest corporate fortunes in the history of capitalism had been built not on superior products or superior efficiency alone, but on a legal and regulatory architecture deliberately designed to make fair competition structurally impossible. The response was enormous and immediate. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had already been moving toward antitrust enforcement, cited the Standard Oil investigation publicly. The Department of Justice began formal proceedings, and in 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it broken into 34 separate companies. Those 34 companies included organizations that would eventually become ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP's American Operations, and Marathon Oil. The breakup of Standard Oil is still the largest antitrust action in American history. It happened because one woman spent 4 years reading public records. Rockefeller was deeply stung. He lived until 1937, long enough to watch the story of his life be reshaped by what Tarbell had written. He called her that poisonous woman in private. He told advisors not to respond publicly because he understood, correctly, that engagement would only amplify her. He gave enormous amounts of money to philanthropic causes in the final decades of his life, and historians have debated ever since whether those donations were genuine expressions of his values or an attempt to write a different ending to his story. Tarbell herself was complicated. She did not consider herself a feminist. She did not support the suffrage movement and was publicly critical of aspects of it, a position that disappointed many who admired her work and saw her as a model for what women could do in public life. She said she believed no woman could be both a wife and a serious professional in the world she inhabited, and she made her choice, but she did not believe that choice should be legislated. She was interested in facts, not causes, in documents, not ideologies. She investigated power because she had watched power destroy her father, and she had decided that understanding it precisely was the only available response. She continued writing until she was in her 80s. She wrote about Abraham Lincoln, about American business leaders, about tariff policy, about the nature of industrial work. None of it matched the Standard Oil investigation in impact, but she worked steadily and carefully until the end. She died in Connecticut in January 1944 at the age of 86. She is buried in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in the town where her father's business had been destroyed and where the oil derricks had once covered every hillside, and where a 14-year-old girl had first understood what privilege looked like when it was exercised without restraint. What Tarbell did was not complicated in concept. She identified a powerful institution that was operating in ways the public did not fully understand. She went to the public record. She read what was there. She wrote down what she found. She published it in a magazine that ordinary Americans read, and the institution fell. The tools she used are still available. The public record still exists. The court documents and congressional testimony and regulatory filings that describe how power actually operates are still there for anyone willing to read them. What Tarbell had, beyond her skill and her patience and her 2 years of research before she published a word, was something simpler than any of that. She had been in the room at 14 years old. She had seen the face her father came home with. She had understood that something wrong had happened, and she had decided, at some level that was more instinct than plan, that she was going to find out exactly what it was. It took her 30 years. But she was not misguided, not even slightly.